the beat.
I don't know who, somebody need to hear this. Y'all don't speak Hebrew, that's Yiddish. How the fuck you try to label us anti-Semitic? We the Israelites, blacks, native Hispanics. The Germans getting locked up for the Holocaust. Meanwhile, black people still up in the Holocaust. 100 million of us died in the transatlantic. 6 million died, y'all want the world to never forget it. You can never be a Jew, you a Ashkenaz. This ain't a star dum-dum, a gun die or die. Yeah, Yeezy told the truth and got ostracized. Not one person in the Bible had on a yarmulke. We were slaves in America like we was in Egypt. Y'all don't even fit the curses in the Torah neither. Y'all was blind to the truth, I had to make it clear. How Jerusalem, your land, your people came from Europe. That was 1947, your menorah got 9 sticks, it's really only 7. Yeah, it's us against the world, Armageddon. This what happened when you inherit lies from your ancestors. Y'all the synagogue of Satan with them black hats. Your whole nation sitting ducks, Aflacs. Bunch of thieves and culture vultures, ain't nothing kosher. To tell the truth, you vagabonds don't have a culture. Macedonia, Alexander and Philip, you a convert, so tell me, how the fuck is you Israel? That don't make you the people just cause you live there. Why my people can't hate your people like y'all hate Hitler? All the prophets was black and was called nigga. Y'all don't even fit the description that's in the scriptures. Abraham, all the way down to Jacob, we the real Jews. Y'all don't study Christ, y'all follow the Talmud. Keep it real, yeah, let's keep it real. Cold hard truth, it give you chills. Say y'all Jewish cause y'all ain't really them. About to do them like Hammond, it's the Feast of Purim. UPK undefeated, this an easy win. We was born fighting, y'all the evil twin. Jacob took hold of his heel, then out came his little red bastard, they kosher deals. It's only 12 tribes, y'all trying to make it 13. Esau despised his birthright, the Lord cursed him. He ain't the devil, who is? I'm still searching. Ask your rabbi, why he get them babies herpes? I don't know what's worse, that or you claiming that you a Maccabee. I'm about to cancel, everybody try to cancel ye. I ain't afraid to speak, that's what I do. They riding to the core, I'm just judging them by their fruit. Cause they ain't suffering curses. If I was carnal, I promise I'd punch you in person. I know this an uncomfortable subject. They making millions off our culture and black people suffering from it. Yeah, they don't believe in Christ, they the Antichrist. Make a living off of niggas, they a parasite. I ain't afraid to tell the truth, niggas terrified. I'm about to go DEFCON 4, I ain't satisfied.
That is proof, that is absolute proof that they know we are the real Jews. That's absolute proof. Now you got the records. Go find me a white Jew on any archaeology in Egypt anywhere. You will never find a piece of archaeology with white people as slaves in Egypt. So don't tell me that they were slaves and it's their identity, and they know it. And another blasphemy of them which say they are Jews. They are not. The Lord knows the blasphemy of you so-called white people that say you are Jews and you are not Jews. You are not the people of the law. You are not God's chosen people. God's chosen people are living in the ghettos of America. God's chosen people are in poverty and depression in the streets of America. God's chosen people are walking around in America with no identity.
Negros indios nativos somos los verdaderos israelitas. ¿Esto dónde lo dice? Esto dice en la Biblia.
Show that Puerto Ricans love America, but that ain't reality.
Police attack was planned beforehand. Only white cops were assigned.
Then our only recourse is to defend ourselves.
We tried to move people onto the sidewalk, but the police were all out for blood.
Another series of protests was staged by thousands of students, parents, and the Brown Berets. In June 1968, the group that had become known as the East LA 13 was released on bail.
Demonstrate to our people and we deserve better and that we could, get better.
I don't think there's ever been a time when we need more of the spirit of the young lords than today.
I guess we had no fear. We just did what we thought at the time was the right thing to do.
captain of the Black Panther Party. They are making it their business to process arresting me and my wife, to a process arresting numerous Panthers on the block.
Police just went in and started beating them viciously. It was ugly. You know, they were just yelling at us, you dirty spicks, dirty Mexicans, you know, who do you think you are?
Hey, listen, brothers and sisters, man. If you like what you hear, hit the subscribe button, man. Subscribe to this channel. And also, please, go to isupk.com and pay your tithe. Drop me some cash so we can move around this planet like we need to, man, and do the things we need to do.
They're one west. They're one west. They're one west. They're
Hey, Shalom, y'all, Bashim Shabrak to all the brothers, Yahweh Shamar Latam, Bashim Yoshai to all the sisters. I'm priest and officer 500 Barak Yala with the I.S.U.P.K, which is the Israelite School of Universal and Practical Knowledge. Started out at 1 West, 125th Street, Harlem, New York, under Committing John YAHANNA. You understand? And just like every Sunday evening, we have the history class from now on until further notice, right? So this is going to be a part 2 of last week's class, where we got into the dark history of slavery in Canada. Again, there's a big misconception that Canada is the Switzerland of the Americas. Really, it's not. Canada is as racist as the US. The only difference is that they don't have their own Confederate flag. That's pretty much it. But Canada hates niggas, spicks, and savages just like the US does. You understand? So we're going to get into it. Let me share my screen. Let me share these slides. We're going to continue from last week. You understand? And shout out to everyone who tuned in. I think I see Nataza Yab, Mosai in Christ. You know, anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat. If you want to be part of the school, click in the sign-in link in the chat as well, right? Come into the school, come to class, change your life, do your 90 days, get your Hebrew name, right? So let me share my screen real quick. Give me 1 second. So I think that's where we left off. We left off at the next slide, but we're just going to go from there. So it was basically breaking down a lot of the so-called nations or tribe, which is the term they use of so-called Native American Indians, which are our Gadite brothers and sisters that were taken in slavery in Canada, right? That's basically where we left off. Salakia. So we're going to start at the end of this slide where it says, south of Lake Ontario lived the Iroquois Confederacy. For an entire century, the French considered the Iroquois Five Nations, to be the scourge of God. If there was any single group of enemy Amerindians the French wanted to reduce to slavery, it was the Iroquois Nation, the most aggressive of which were the Mohawk. For those who don't remember, the Iroquois was one of the so-called tribes, for lack of better words, that said that they had a peace treaty with France. Again, not one treaty was respected. Our person is the goddamn devil. He lies all the time. He should have never been trusted whatsoever. Whether it's coming over here, making any peace, so-called peace treaties. They just signed a peace treaty with Palestine. Best believe, who knows, maybe by next week, who knows, maybe tomorrow, the ceasefire with Palestine is going to be over. The point is, the people they signed a peace treaty with, they said they were the scourge of God. They said if there's any so-called natives that it is a must to reduce to slavery, it's the Mohawks. That's what the French said. Once Amerindian slavery was established in the mid-17th century, the French began considering enslaving the Iroquois. In 1687, Governor Brisé de Denonville sent Iroquois prisoners to France where they toiled as galley slaves. Again, so-called Native American Indians fit the curses. They were on slave ships like we were. You understand? They were sent to the West Indies and they were sent back to Europe as well. Louis the 15th, Louis the 14th, found these slave imports profitable and encouraged the governor to capture the greatest possible number of Iroquois, robust and accustomed to the task, so they could serve on galleys. If this may sound somewhat familiar, that's what Christopher Columbus said when he brought the so-called Taino Indians back to Spain. What did he say? Out of 1,100 Taino Indians, which he brought from, if I'm not mistaken, Puerto Rico or Hispaniola, which is modern-day Haiti and Dominican Republic, he said, out of these 1,100, those 300 that survive, he said, is good business. What did King Louis XIV said? He said that these slave imports, bringing the so-called natives back to France, is a profitable import, meaning is good business. That's what it means. You understand? The French, the Spaniards, the Portuguese, the British, the Dutch, the Germans, the Russians, a devil is a devil. Right? Let's get back to these slides. Slovakia. To the south of the Iroquois territory near the Ohio River lived the Wolf tribe, allies of the Iroquois. 3 members of this tribe were held in slavery. And why are they specifying these tribes? Because on documents, it did mention the tribe they were from. When it did not mention the specific tribe they were from, they were just classified as Pani Indians. That's it. Because just like you're Jamaican, you're Haitian, you're so-called, African American, for lack of better words, a nigga's a nigga to them. And a savage is savage. They didn't care to identify which specific tribe you were enslaving. You were all niggas, spics, and savages for them. The tribe was sometimes confused with another tribe living south of the Iroquois territory, variously called Mohicans, Mohegan, Marengan, or Moringans. French colonial documents describe them as English Amerindians, or on the English side. For those who don't know, so-called natives had, you could say, they were allies with either the French or the English. Really, they were swindled. Just you understand, they were swindled into not being oppressed, not going to slavery, not being slaughtered. So they picked their side. Why? Because the French was at war with the English. That's why. At the end of the day, both of them are committing a genocide on the people. Both of them are mass raping the women, the men, the women, and the children. And both of them were enslaving Amerindians. Between 1748 and 1760, 5 members of this tribe were in New France during the final years of colonial struggle between Great Britain and France. Now, this is gonna give you, I'm gonna skip this slide. It's gonna say slaves from all over, from whatever Gadite so-called tribe, were all slaves, basically. There's not one Gadite tribe that was not enslaved. Whether it's from the Midwest, the North, the South, the East Coast, they all went to slavery like we did. You understand? Slovakia. There you go. Let's go there. The number of new slaves appearing in the historical record only begins to be significant after 1709, the year in which Intendant Godot legalized slavery. Before 1709, it was not legalized, but it was authorized, and it was just common practice. It was not a written law. You understand? It was more it's just customary to just enslave us. It was not a written law, right? Give me 1 second. Slovakia. So then, in the last 2 decades of French rule, the total number of slaves reached 400 and 500 due to the importance of the fur trade, which made it easier to acquire Amerindian slaves. They're gonna make in school in Canada, they learned that The only dealings they had with so-called natives was the fur trade. If that's the truth, if that's a fact, why were they reduced to reservations? Because they were oppressed, they committed a genocide on the people, and they also enslaved them. With the decline of the fur trade, the number of Amerindian slaves then quickly fell off, whereas the number of blacks rose suddenly to well over 600 as loyalists fleeing the American Revolution brought their black slaves up to Canada. Subsequently, after 1800, but well before the formal abolition, however you say the word, of slavery in Canada, blacks continued arriving in Quebec, but the documents indicate almost no slaves. Indeed, slavery was already gradually disappearing, and judges were unwilling to punish fugitive slaves. So basically, who are the loyalists? The loyalists were devils who remain loyal, hence the term loyalists. They remain loyal to the British Crown. And Canada is still a commonwealth of the British Empire. They remain loyal to them. When America revolted against, trying to separate themselves from Britain, what they did is they fled up to Canada. Really, Canadians are just, they're the same devils. They're either French or they're babies from Britain. But what they did is that fleeing to Canada, they took the slaves with them. So again, to all those so-called foundational Black Americans who don't even consider Black Canadians as their brothers, a lot of them really are just Judites. Are you just going to hate on Judites because they're in Canada? This is insane, because at the end of the day, what you're doing is exactly what the white man wants you to do, to separate yourself from the people and divide yourself from your people, as if we're not destroyed enough. But a lot of so-called Black Canadians, right, are Judites. That's it. We're brought here as slaves. Either they were bought in the 13 colonies, they were taken from the 13 colonies, or they came over here with their slave masters who were loyalists. That's it. We're convinced that our 17th and 18th century Canadian ancestors had more slaves than the 4185 identified in the dictionnaire. We say this because from the early 18th century onwards, owners complained how hard it was to hold on to their Amerindian slaves. Moreover, given that Amerindian slaves were often baptized late in life, either because of their religious education took time or because they were in no hurry to be baptized, it follows that many of these slaves died before being baptized and therefore do not appear in the civil registry. That's why the only slave that you will see documented is not the only number of slaves there were in Canada. A lot of them were not even classified as slaves. They're classified as servants or property of such and such. Then there was those who were baptized and those who were not baptized. For those who were not baptized, they definitely were not appear in the civil registry. If no documented trace can be found of their sale, then such slaves simply do not turn up in the record. Could there have been 100, 200, 300 or more of these undocumented persons? And like we seen last week, I think it was in 1709 when slavery was legal on paper in Canada, that is starting notarizing the sales, meaning, giving a receipt. You understand? Before that, listen, you give me money and I give you a person and that's it. There's no receipt. It's not documented, right? Until 1700. In lobbying Black slaves, Canadians emphasized particularly to need to cultivate the land, just like they did in America, throughout the Americas and the Caribbean as well. We should therefore examine the geographical breakdown of the slave population to determine whether slaves lived in the countryside or the city. In the following pages, we list the places where slaves were held, but only when it is known that these slaves were Amerindians or Blacks. This inventory by region is based on an administrative regions called gouvernement, which is the word for government, under the French regime. Given that the gouvernement of Quebec, Trois-Rivières, and Montreal correspond roughly to regions in the age of slavery. So government is not like today. The government really is just the region of it in the days of slavery. That's what they're saying, right? So in the administrative region of Quebec, we include additional territories coming under it where slaves were found: Acadia, Cape Sable, and Webull. They might mention Detroit because Detroit was still part of French Canada, right, at the time. Lake Champlain until 1763, the Ontario region under the French regime, and then from 1774 to 1791, Detroit, Michilimackinac, and Fort Duquesne were officially part of Quebec until 1783. In fact, until 1796. And finally, on the Mississippi River at Kaskaskia, the Sainte Famille mission was administered by the Séminaire de Québec, whereas the mother house of the Jesuits was also in Quebec. The abundance of slaves in the Great Lakes region, especially Amerindian slaves, should not come as a surprise since the main towns in the region, Detroit and Michilimackinac, were in the middle of Indian country. Of these regions, the one with the highest prevalence of slavery was Canada under the French regime, in other words, on the north and south shore of the St. Lawrence River. Here's the thing, a lot of devils over here are saying that, slavery, they're saying that there was no slavery in Canada. When you show them slavery, they're going to say that it was mainly the British. You're going to find out again, most of the slave masters over here were of French descent. So like we have Officer 1000 ADR joining us. Hey, Shalom, so Yabasha Shwakta.
Hey, Shalom, praise Yabasha Shwakta. What's going on, man?
Torah for being here with us. I don't want, right, let's keep reading these slides. And again, a lot of these so-called Gadites, right, were taken from the Midwest, such as regions like Detroit, when it was under the French regime. On the banks of the St. Lawrence River, 3,264 slaves were found overwhelmingly in two regions. Montreal led the way with 2,077 slaves, which is 63.6%. Many of whom were acquired from Amerindian nations through the fur trade, Montreal's economic lifeblood. Listen, Montreal, over here we have the old port. Listen, we have one that I think is probably the major port in Canada. You understand? Or one of the major ports in Canada. Before they were sending all the goods that we acquired today, they were sending fur and slaves. That's what they were doing. You understand? Montreal had the most slaves in Canada at the time when it was under the French regime. I mean, even when Canada as a whole became under the British regime, besides the province of Quebec, till this day still French, Montreal still was number one with the amount of slaves it had. The region of Quebec, the Quebec region followed with 1,063 individuals, 32.6%. And just a reminder again, don't focus too much on the numbers because those are just individuals that appear in public registries, right? And we know why a lot of individuals did not appear in public registries. And it is interesting to note the larger proportion of Black slaves in Quebec. The geographically small and sparsely populated region of Trois-Rivières had only a modest iron industry and no more than 115 slaves, which is roughly 3.5% of the 3,264 slaves. The administrative authorities of New France sought slaves mainly for the cultivation of land. The king agreed to this request, but no slave ship ever reached the colony, which meant that the colonists had to acquire slaves by other means. However, slaves did not end up where we would most expect them. They were found in towns rather than in the countryside. Quebec, the capital of the colony, had 970 slaves, 460 of them Amerindians and 570 Blacks. Montreal had yet more slaves, a total of 1,525, which is 1,007 of them Amerindians and 518 Blacks. In other words, 2,495 slaves lived in towns, over 3/4 of the total number in New France and subsequently in colonial Quebec under the British regime. Slavery here was an urban phenomenon, right? And again, when they say no slave ship ever reached the colony, no major slave ship that was sent by the, what is it? I think it's called the Compagnie des Indes. I forgot to say it in English, right? That was sanctioned by the crown were sent. The slaves that came here by ship were just more like, for lack of better words, sold by private contractors. But most of the slaves were not even acquired by them. They were acquired through the British colonies or through what they call Indian country, to the so-called Amerindian slave market, because there was Amerindian slave markets, just like there was black slave markets, because we're the same people going through the same exact thing, which we're going to go into just now, the slave market. We're going to find out that Montreal had a slave market. So the city of Quebec. On June 15th, 1709, Madeleine Just, wife of Pierre Hugh Diouville, La Découverte, sold a panier to Pierre Thomas Tarieux de La Pérade, husband of Madeleine Jarret de Verchères. Then on October 19th, Jacques Neveu sold the panier Mary to his own brother. In September 1796, Louis Payet, parish priest of Saint-Antoine-sur-Richelieu, sold a black woman, Rose, to Thomas Lee, and Jean-Baptiste Routier sold his mulatto to Louis-Charles Fouché. These examples constitute of the first 2 slave sales in Quebec in 1709, and then the very last 2 much sales in 1796. Again, these are sales on paper. They were selling slaves before 1709. But on paper, it started in 1709. Buyers and sellers were French-speaking Canadian in each case. On April 13, 1709, Intendant Rodot issued an ordinance making it legal to buy and sell slaves. All Panis and Negroes who have been and who shall hereafter be bought belong in full ownership to those who purchased them as slaves. So again, when they say when they try to lie about there was no slavery in Canada, they had laws making it legal to buy and sell Native Americans and black people in Canada. They made the law. They can't hide their history. They're just not as proud as the U.S. to boast about them having slaves. But they did. And most of them were French descent slave masters. According to the 1685 edition of the Code Noir, which is the Black Code, but also the 1724 edition specially drafted for Louisiana, another part of New France, slaves were likened to personal property. The Code Noir never came into force in St. Lawrence Valley, but slaves were considered to be personal property here as elsewhere, and Canadians treated them as such. By personal property, we mean that slaves were owned in just the same way as livestock. You were equal to cattle. Again, there's a reason it's called chattel slavery. You understand? The only difference between the slave and the cow was that the slave was worth 5 times as much as the cow. That's the only difference. The same mercantile approach was taken to slaves under the British regime. Meaning what? Meaning it was done under the French first. And then the British didn't change anything. They just kept it as is. In a 1783 advertisement, the printer William Brown offered an 18-year-old black woman for sale, adding, "We also have a lovely bay mare available." Meaning what? Meaning the mare was not, they were not focused on selling the livestock first. Even though you were as equal as the livestock, they were selling slaves before they were selling livestock. You understand? And sometimes they were damn near giving it to you for free as a bonus. It's like they call it a 2. What do they call it today? 2 for 1? Buy one, get one free. Guess what? You buy the slaves, you get the mare for free. An English-speaking resident of Quebec City offered a 13-year-old black boy for sale, as well as a black woman aged 26, along with a horse, cart, and harness. Slaves could be offered for sale along with animals, and could be exchanged for animals. This, for example, was the case of John Turner, a Montreal merchant who struck a deal with a Bostonian to trade the black Josiah Cutton, about 22 years old, for a gray horse and 31 pounds 10 shillings. Listen, he struck a deal. He's like, you know what? I'm gonna trade the little black boy for a horse. That's it. And what, 31 pounds 10 shillings? However, that was worth at the time. They call it a deal. You ain't worth not much than cattle. Kawakan, Salaka, go ahead.
Salaka, priest, I don't mind to cut you off, but what you're bringing out is so heavy because a lot of Canadians, especially over here in Quebec, they don't know that type of history. They don't teach that type of history in the school system. Most white people in Quebec think that they didn't have slaves over here. Understand? And come to find out, Quebec was one of the major centers for slavery in Canada. And also, like lately, I've been seeing like people, especially with Trump, people saying, well, Trump cares about the missing children, human trafficking. Canada is built according to real history that you're bringing out. Canada is built on human trafficking.
Damn right. No, that's absolutely right. Canada, just like the U.S., the whole Western Hemisphere has been built on human trafficking. We're not even going to select which part of the Western Hemisphere. The whole Western Hemisphere is built on human trafficking. No matter how hard they try to hide it, at the end of the day, they documented the sales. Even the documents they try to destroy is part of their history. And that devil who wrote the book is, again, it's not a book that was written by a brother. You can't say we're biased by choosing a book that fits our narrative because a black man wrote it. You understand? It's like, for instance, the Willie Lynch letters, which we went over, 2-3 weeks ago? They were fake. What was true, though, is the Black Code. It's part of the French history. You understand? Those laws they set in place to legalize slavery is Canadian history. French Canadian history. So not only were they slaves in Canada, but for those who say, well, it was just the British, most of them were French. And just like Officer Adiar just said, not only was Quebec was damn near the stronghold for slavery in Canada. You understand? And Montreal had the most slaves in Canada. Slovakia. Let's get there. Since slaves were treated as personal property, they could serve as security for debts. Meaning what? Meaning it's like going to the pawn shop. Literally. In 1784, Elizabeth Chautelet, wife of Alexander Bisset, master of languages, was a creditor of the innkeeper Patterson of Sorel. Patterson owed 40 pounds Quebec currency of roughly $160. Right? The Pattersons handed a 12-year-old black girl over to Bisset as security, but if the Pattersons paid off the loan, they would get their slave back. Listen, the white man is the devil. Even a baptized person could become personal property. What we read last week is that if you're baptized, maybe there was a chance for you not to be a slave. Listen, there was always a cheat code for them to reduce you to slavery. Baptized or not, it did not matter. Could a baptized slave be treated as personal property, just like an animal? How could such a practice be reconciled with the fact that the Charter of 1627 automatically granted full citizenship to the baptized person? And that's really, I don't know if the term is oxymoron, I forgot what the term exactly, but how are you granting citizenship to people of the land when you're not of the land? How does that make sense? The oppressor is the goddamn devil the Bible speaks of. That's how. The problem arose in the court of Montreal in 1733. A paducah belonging to Philip U. Duville de la Découverte was seized and then sold. But this slave was a baptized Catholic. Uville de la Découverte sought on the grounds of baptism to have the Conseil supérieur void the sale and also reprimand the judge who had ordered the sale. The Conseil handed the problem over to the intendant, who we know was in charge, as per the king's ruling, who upheld the court's decision. When the king was apprised of the situation, he refused to give his opinion on Amerindian slavery and replied instead that customary practice should be followed. Meaning what? This meant that baptized Amerindians could be sold as slaves. Why? Because it's customary to just sell savages and niggers. This problem reappeared during a trial in 1740. The Pani Marie Marguerite, whom Chevalier d'Ormicourt was on the point of transporting to the Caribbean, used every possible argument in court to avoid being sent into exile. In a brief drawn up by a legal practitioner, she pleaded that as a baptized Catholic, she should be allowed to regain her liberty. This argument was not admitted, however, and she lost her trial, and she was sold as a slave. As a result of this case in 1740 and Intendant Ocar ruling in 1733, slaves could be sold even if they were baptized Catholics. We found at least 5 Amerindian slaves who fit this description. This problem did not arise for blacks. However, they could not cite Article 17 of the Charter of the Compagnie des Sans Associés. As a result, no legal objections were raised when baptized blacks were sold. You understand? Even though they say it was not an issue for blacks, but listen, it's the custom. Let's not change our ways. That's basically what the king is saying. We've been selling them for the longest. Why change it because they were baptized? I mean, a baptized slave is just a baptized savage or a baptized nigger. And we're selling them as slaves. We're enslaving them. Why change that? It's not going to do anything. Not going to change anything. You understand? Catholic, Christian, Baptist, a slave is a slave. You're just a baptized slave. That's it. You're still a slave. Inheriting a slave was a profitable option. The most interesting examples of slaves being inherited when Charles Le Moyne, first Baron de Longueuil, left his 2 sons a legacy of 7 black slaves. One of Baron's sons inherited the father and mother with 3 children, while the other son inherited 2 other children, but as a way of making the distribution more equitable, he also obtained a pani men and women from his brother. As they say, you know, we need to split it equally. That's crazy. The public slave market is sold by auction. Yes, we were also, just like we were sold on slave auctions, there was auctions for slaves in America, throughout the Caribbean, Central and South America. There were also slave auctions in Canada. As a matter of fact, we're going to see that they were advertised in the newspapers. You understand? Was there a public slave market in Canada the way there was in the 13 colonies and in the Caribbean? And if there was such a market, was it in continuous operation or only occasionally? The historical records does not enable us to provide a satisfactory answer to these questions. In 1733, when Hugh Duville de la Découverte claimed in court to be shocked that a baptized Amerindian was sold at auction, he referred to a slave sold in a public market just like animals. We were equal to cattle. Was he referring to an actual slave market in Montreal, or was this merely a colorful figure of speech designed to impress the judge? Benjamin Salt stated categorically, no Negro or Pawnee was ever sold in Canada at public auction. But Salt was wrong about this. Public sales of slaves at auction definitely occurred in Canada. We only know of one such case under the French regime when, in 1733, the merchant Charles Nolan de Lamarck bought a Paducah on the market square, who had previously been seized from Hugh Duville de la Découverte. Several more public slave sales took place under the British regime. In Quebec City, in 1778, Captain Thomas Venture offered his mulatto slave Isabella at auction, and the butcher Hips made the highest bid. According to the Quebec Gazette, which is one of the oldest newspapers in Quebec, there was to be a sale on October 5th, 1782, of a young black by auctioneers in their public showroom in Rue Notre-Dame in Quebec City, which is one of the major streets in Quebec City. John Brooks of Quebec offered a black for sale, specifying that the slave could be inspected in his home until May 20th, after which he would be offered in a public sale. In 1765, 2 public slave sales took place. William Ward of Vermont sold a black man and woman and a black boy to William Campbell of Montreal, and the following month, Campbell resold the 3 slaves to Dr. Charles Blake. In 1791, the auctioneer put a young black up for auction. Moreover, these public sales and auctions were regularly advertised in newspapers, meaning what? Even if they say they only have one slave auction recorded under the French regime, it's been going on. You understand? Just like they limited the amount of slaves they put in the public registry. Listen, not because their name don't appear that they were not slaves. You understand? It's been going on. It was public record. It's in the old newspapers. Between 1767, when the first slave sale ad appeared, and 1798, when the last such ad came out, there were at least 137 advertisements for 30 different slaves. Only one of these 30 different slaves was Amerindian, a Pani woman whom the merchants Melvin Wills and Burns offered for sale in July 1782 in the Quebec Gazette. One ad featured a young black man who was trained in domestic service and knew how to shave and style hair. Prospective buyers who preferred a black woman could read in another ad of a slave who had belonged to Governor Murray and had now become the slave of Prentice, the tavern keeper. She was a good servant who knew how to milk cows and made butter to perfection. We're not even going to Salakia. Go through these, you understand? There were slaves auctions in Quebec, in Montreal. Let's go to the last paragraph. It is clear that slaves were indeed put up for auction in Quebec and Montreal and sold to the highest bidder. You understand? Slave auction occurred in Canada, especially in Quebec and Montreal. Listen, that old port has a lot of history of shipping slaves. If you were tired of your slave, you send it mainly to Martinique, but any French colonies in the Caribbean, to make sure they don't run back to their family. They have no ways to escape the island. You understand? They were selling slaves over here. Slovakia. They were inspecting us. As a matter of fact, Natazia who's in the chat, Natazia has a bully pit bull. People who are in the dog breeding business, you understand? You really, a lot of animals. But you might mainly see it with dog breeding, right? You inspect the dogs. You check their teeth. You check their ears. You check their joint if they have hip dysplasia, elbow dysplasia, right? If they have, especially for dogs like bullies or German shepherds, if they have, their spinal cord, is it aligned correctly, or is their back bent? They were inspecting us just like they were inspecting animals. In Canada as well. You understand? Canadians were inveterate horse dealers, intent on outwitting and outmaneuvering their opponents, and this approach must also have been taken when prospective buyers and sellers got together to deal in slaves. The same way they're going to inspect the horse to make sure the horse has all his teeth, his hooves are not cracked, his legs are strong, you understand? He could carry weight. His mane is not dirty, whatever the case is. They were inspecting slaves the same way they were inspecting livestock. It says advice was always available for slave trading. Do not accept subjects below 4.5 feet in height, depending on their gender. According to Van Alstyne, it is advisable to have surgeons examine the subjects. They should examine the eyes, mouth, noble parts, get the slaves to walk, run, and cough loudly with their hands placed on the groin in order to detect hernias. An anonymous directive from 1769 urges buyers to avoid wrinkled old men with dangling and shriveled testicles. No big skinny Negroes with narrow chest, wild eyes, or the look of an imbecile, which is a harbinger of epilepsy. Listen, they did the same for men, women, children, the same way they were expecting the men. You understand? You see how they describe the wrinkly old men with dangling and shriveled testicles. Listen, how do you think they were inspecting the kids? We know how much of a deviant or oppressor is. A lot of the slaves were sold as kids. Most of the slaves did not live past 20 years, if I'm not mistaken, for Gadites, in past 25 for Negroes. You think, listen, they were inspecting the kids the same way they were inspecting the older slaves, the same way they were inspecting every single animal. You see how do you see the accurate description they're given on what to look for and what not to look for in buying a slave? They were inspecting us like cattle, just like they were doing in the U.S. throughout the Americas and the Caribbean. That's what they did in Canada. So, like, we could skip this one. Young merchandise. According to slave traders, a good marketable Negro, also known as a pièce d'Inde, should not be over 30 years of age, since black slaves over this age quickly lost their value. Meaning what? The younger they were acquired, the better. The more valuable they were.
So like what you just read about the selling of the slave, and when they present them but naked in front of everybody, it sounds almost like in sport when they're doing the weighting.
Kawakan.
Yeah, it sounds exactly like that.
That's exactly it. Hey, Justice, Shalom, we're going to get to your question just now, but that's exactly it. The same way you're being expected when you go into sports, whether it's American football. I have to specify American because y'all playing the fake football, so like it. Take a nigga to council if you see fit. American football, basketball, you see the same way fighters step on a scale and you inspect them, you check their weight. If they need to be switched to a different class, welterweight, featherweight, whatever the case is, they've been doing that with slaves the whole time. You understand? Justice, if you could type in your question, we'll get to it. Salaka, one, give me 2 seconds, Wabakusha. You could keep reading the slide. So you're on mute.
Salaki, I was doing all this on mute. Salaki, but I was saying, like, this is what you're saying right now is exactly what was going on. And now have that picture in your mind. Now imagine women, wives, men, husband, children, little boys, little girls, naked like this. That brother on the screen, he has at least short. They were, most of the time those slaves were naked, being inspected by everybody. You understand? This is how they treated your ancestors, man. You understand? You in the US, you know the story pretty much. But in Canada, a lot of white people do not know if this took place in Canada. You understand? So like, go ahead, preach.
Damn right. And a lot of brothers really don't even know this took place in Canada either. Because I went to school in Canada. They don't teach us that in school. They don't even teach us they committed genocide on the natives. We know that, right? But they basically don't teach you anything about slavery. Unless in the U.S., they can't hide it in the U.S. Over here, they hide it. You understand? And just like also what Adiyar was saying, it's not even almost all the time the slaves were naked. The slaves were naked all the time to be expected. How are you gonna know how my stones look like? You understand? They were doing that to the old and to the young. As a matter of fact, I'm gonna just bring up a precept real quick. Was it Deuteronomy 28? I think it's verse 50. Let's start at 49. As a matter of fact, give me 1 second. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 49. The Lord shall bring a nation against thee from far. That's us going to captivity. That's us being reduced to slavery by these devils. From the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand. Verse 50, a nation of fierce countenance. The way they were dealing with us, they were merciless. You understand? Which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favor to the young. They didn't give a damn how old the slave was, how young the slaves were when they were buying and selling them, when they were inspecting them, right? They didn't give a damn about that. Salakia. I mean, Justice said, I read it in the rest of Esther how Haman is an Amalekite labeled as Macedonian. The question is, does Josephus have an account of the Amalekites taking over Shittim? I would have to go over it. I'm not quite sure, so I would have to go over it. If I may, just get back to you. When am I teaching class in English next week? Next Thursday, right, is going to be the next English class. I'm going to get back to you on that because I would have to go over it, right? Salakia. Unless Officer Adia could be able to answer the question, but I would have to get back to you on that. Get back to the slide. So again, the younger the slaves were, the more value they had. The older they were, past what? It should not be over 30 years of age, which was not a common thing for us to live that long anyways. Say with them, they were nothing at that point. So they acquired young slaves at a very young age all the time, right? Of the 25 blacks whose age is indicated in the deed of sale, 12 were under 20 years of age, 10 were under 30, and 3 were over 30. However, the last 3 do not appear to have been bargains, since Sullivan, in buying a 33-year-old black slave, ended up with a lot of grief, as we shall see. The average of these 25 blacks was just 18.8 years. Prospective buyers of Amerindian slaves were also concerned about age, since they wanted to keep their slaves in bondage as long as possible. What did we just read? A nation of fierce countenance, which show favor nor to the old nor the young. It doesn't matter. You're 5 years old, you're going to slavery. You're going to be a slave as long as possible. That's what they were saying. There was the added challenge of Amerindians being tempted to return to their native ways in the forest. Masters thus took Amerindian slaves at as young an age as possible, Salakia, in order to familiarize them with the values of French civilization and make them less likely to run away as adults. They're erasing your culture. They're beating their culture into you. They did that until what? When the last residential school in Canada was closed down in 1997. You understand? Civil registries tell us more than deeds of sale about the age of Amerindian slaves. We know that the average Amerindian slave died at 17 and a half years of age. This was an eyeball estimate, which means slaves were generally acquired during adolescence and especially childhood, meaning what? They were stripping these kids naked and inspecting them like cattle. You understand? They were doing that to kids. Based on deeds of sale alone, Amerindians were sold into slavery between the ages of 5. Listen, when I just said if you're 5 years old, you go to slavery, I was just I had forgot that was in the book. I was just saying this. You understand? It's a lot here, but clearly they were selling slaves from the ages of 5 and 25 years. And on the average, at the age of 14 years, which gives an indication of just how young Amerindian slaves were. And this is why, listen, in the book of Obadiah, chapter 1, verse 10, right, or verse 9 and 10, when it says it tells you the reason why the Caucasian nation will be eradicated. It has nothing to do with their blonde hair and blue eyes at all. It's for that reason that we just read right here. They were selling slaves as young as 5 years old. It's for the crime they committed against our people. That's why they're going to be exterminated. Of course, after they serve us, just like we serve them as slaves. Just like Isaiah chapter 14 and 2 says, we will rule over our oppressors. It is inevitable. You understand? As a matter of fact, let's get real quick. Revelation chapter 13. Let's go to verse 9. It's the book of Revelation chapter 13 verse 9. If any man have an ear, let him hear. Meaning, if you have understanding, understand this. Verse 10, he that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. These 5-year-old, they led 5-year-old native Indian kids into captivity. Best believe that 5-year-old Conor McGregor, when he comes back, will be in captivity. You understand? 5-year-old Justin Bieber will be in captivity. These 5-year-old Canadian, British, Russian kids will be in captivity. As per what we just read. Revelation 13 and 10. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. The word must means that it is a necessity. It must happen. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. Let's get back to the slides. They're going in chains just like we went in chains. Salakia. In 1762, one Falson had a Pani woman in his household who he claimed to have bought from a ship surgeon. The Jewish merchant Eleazar Levi maintained in court that he was the real owner since he had bought the slave from Joseph Lauren. Levi won the case. So I just had the slide specifically to show you that some of the slave masters were Jewish. Yeah, Jewish people said, you know, they didn't have a hand in the slavery or whatever. They were treated as bad. Listen, they owned you. Just like they still own you today. Even in Canada, there were Jewish slave masters. They're Jewish slave owners. That's why I had this slide right here. That's it. That's the fun fact of the day. Yeah? Owners at all levels of society. As we read last week, they were owners at all levels of society. Even the just random white man could own a slave. Don't believe the hype that they're saying, well, slave was so expensive. Slave, you could, how do you call it? You could lease a slave, just like you're leasing a car. Just like you're getting a credit card and you pay interest. You could do that with slaves. You understand? Colonial Canada's population of legal slaves was made up of Native Amerindians and blacks bought and sold in private transactions or auctioned off to the highest bidder in a public market. We should examine whether slave ownership was restricted to the most powerful members of society and whether any particular group of society, such as the clergy, which is the church, refused on principle to enslave other human beings. As we seen last week, the church did not refuse anything when it came to slavery. Our history of slavery can conveniently be divided in two traditional periods, the French regime and the British regime. In this respect, the influential 19th century nationalist historian François-Xavier Garneau claimed that slavery in Quebec was largely a British institution. So first off, historians like him are the reason why we don't know nothing about slavery in Canada. They either say it did not exist, or they say, like he did, that in Quebec, which is the French province of Canada, it was a British thing. It was not a French thing. That's what he's saying. Why? Because again, French is painted as, you know, the people who are here to educate the people. They're here to educate savages. They're just missionaries who are here to convert people to the Catholic faith and embrace Jesus Christ. That's who the French like to portray themselves to be. You understand? Which we've seen it to be a lie. Now, was this really the case? Were slave owners of French or of British origin? Before 1760, they were necessarily all or almost all of French origin. Whereas after the conquest, a certain number of British slave owners settled in Quebec. Actually, of 1,535 individual owners, we found that 1,312, which is roughly 85%, were of French origin, whereas 223, just 14%, were of British origin. Meaning what? Most of these slave masters were French. Most of them were French. Therefore, you could conclude that it was a French thing in Canada, mainly a French thing. Damn near 90% were French. Our study of Quebec's slavery from 1632 to 1834 has enabled us to establish that owners of French origin were the leading slave owners, given that they accounted for 2,858 or 86% of all known owners. Even more significant is the fact that these slave owners of French origin owned 79% of all Amerindian slaves. Not only were they the biggest slave masters, they owned them near all the native slaves. Evidently, once the British settled in Quebec following the conquest, it was much harder for them to acquire Amerindian slaves than it had been for the French prior to 1760, given the rapid decline of the fur trade. The fur trade declining does not mean they were freeing their native slaves, just to let you know. The list of surnames does not give an idea of the relative importance of these families in terms of slave ownership. Some families had more slaves than others, and the same family name was shared by several distinct slave-owning families, such as the Bourassa, Campeau, Côté, Cardinal, Hubert-Lacroix, and Le Duc families, each of which owned several slaves, and each of which are popular family names in Quebec. Slavery was formally established and was a formally established institution, and as such, the highest authorities in the colony, both secular and religious, owned slaves. The church had its hand into slavery. Under the French regime, at least 4 governors general owned slaves. In 1679, Brad de Frontenac entrusted the convent of the Ursulines of Quebec with the education of an Amerindian girl considered as slaves. And in 1674, he seemed to have been the recipient of a young slave boy that Louis Joliet brought back from the Mississippi and who drowned before arriving. In 1671, Rémy de Courcelles received 2 Potawatomi slaves from the Iroquois. Rigaud de Vaudreuil, governor from 1703 to 1725, had 11 slaves, including 4 blacks. And if I'm not mistaken, the city of Vaudreuil was named after him. The Marquis Laboche de Beauharnois, governor from 1726 to 1746, had 27 slaves. Vaudreuil Cavagnal, son of the first Vaudreuil, governor from 1755 to 1760, had 16 slaves. 13 of whom were blacks, and 3 more were Amerindians, including the Pani Marie-Louise, whom he had received from his father. Salakia. This is just more slave owners. They're going to show that they were French. We could skip this one. Senior British officials. This will get interesting because one of them you will see is his name is very popular in Canada, right? Senior British officials also held slaves. Governor General Murray had at least one black woman slave whom he transferred to the tavern keeper Miles Prentice in 1766. He seems to have been the only governor of the British regime who owned a slave. In November 1768, Lieutenant Governor Hector Theophilus Kame bought a 15-year-old mulatto girl, selling her off again the following April. Slovakia, a lieutenant governor of Detroit from the time when Detroit was part of Quebec, and husband Marie Julie Guillaume had a few slaves. We could skip this one. Can we go this one? Yeah, let's go to this one to show the church also not only we're not opposed to slavery, but church officials own slaves, such as bishops, priests, and nuns. So we already mentioned the 19th century historian François-Xavier Garneau, who flattered the church with the following statement, perhaps as a way of excusing himself from his previous attacks, that the government and Canadian clergy should be honored for consistently opposing the introduction of blacks into Canada. Actually, we could not find any single instance where the clergy opposed introducing blacks into Canada. The church never was against having black slaves, whether in Canada or throughout the Americas and the Caribbean. Individual clergymen may have stood against slavery, for example, during a 1740 trial involving a Pani slave, when Chevalier d'Ormicourt testified that he was astonished to see priests and monks secretly arming against him without prior warning in order to snatch away his slave, and to see clergymen groundlessly attacking the reputation of an honest man while treating a rascally wench and a libertine gently with all consideration. Libertine is another word for whore. Not that she was a whore, but they considered our women, till this day, they see our women as sexual objects. But were these priests and monks intervening on behalf of the Pani because she was treated as a slave, or were they defending an Amerindian woman who claimed to be the daughter of a Canadian officer? And even if it turned out that these clergy secretly armed against d'Ormicourt because they were opposed to slavery, that does not change the fact that bishops, priests, and religious communities all owned slaves. In a society where slavery was sanctioned by law, practiced by the most prominent people, and widely accepted as a social fact, we do not see why the clergy would have acted differently from the rest of the society. The church, after all, had the same property rights. 4 bishops were slave owners. In 1690, Bishop Saint-Vallier sought treatment at the Hôtel Dieu de Québec for the young Amerindian Bernard, who belonged to him. In 1734, Bishop Dosquet arrived in Quebec with a black man in his service. In April 1754, Bishop Pontbriand owned the Pani Joseph, who was admitted to the Hôtel Dieu de Québec. During his European travels in 1819 to 1820, Bishop Plessis was accompanied by a black slave. Listen, priests, nuns, bishops, they all had slaves. You understand? As a matter of fact, the biggest what do you call it? Female religious organization that can be found in, I think it's in Montreal or Quebec or the city of Quebec, had slaves. Slovakia. Let's start with this one to show that even the nuns had slaves. As a matter of fact, the nuns also owned slaves. The Hôpital Général de Québec had a black slave, a deserter from the 13 colonies. As we read last week, it didn't matter if you fled the U.S. into Canada, you were a slave anywhere you went. Who had been donated to them by Governor General. He was baptized in 1733. 6 years later, a Pani sought treatment at the Hôtel Dieu de Québec. The Hôtel Dieu de Montréal seems to have owned 3 Amerindian women and 1 black woman. The sisters of the congregation of Notre Dame had a fox girl in bondage, Tonton, who died at the Hôtel Dieu de Québec in April 1733. They also had a black male in bondage, baptized in Montreal in 1771 and buried 2 years later. The Hôpital Général de Montréal had more slaves than any other women's religious community. There you go. They had more slaves than any other women religious community. Nuns also had slaves. Matter of fact, the nuns in Montreal had the most slaves. In 1763, a female member of the Jarret de Verchères family, who was the widow of a member of the Rimbaud de Saint-Blain family, donated a teenage Pani to the hospital. Before heading back to France the following year, the merchant André Grasset de Saint-Sauveur gave the hospital his 11-year-old Pani girl, who was baptized in 1772. The same institution had a Stu who was baptized in 1774 in Chateauguay. Chateauguay, for those who don't know, that's the town or city right next to the native reservation over here. It's like 20 minutes away from here. And those general hospitals or Hôpital Général are still open today. Bishops, priests, nuns, and members of religious communities thus owned 100 slaves, and a relatively small number, although what counts in this case is not the overall number of slaves, but the fact that religious owned slaves at all. They all own slaves. You understand? Then we could skip this one. Yeah, we can skip this one as well. They were basically saying some people were just, simple farmers who held slaves. Everybody held slaves. There was not a specific class of people that held slaves. You understand? And make it seem like in America they say, well, most slaves were men and slaves were expensive. Listen, in the US, 40% of slave owners were women. You didn't have to be rich of a high class to own a slave. You could credit a slave, meaning you pay for it later. Or you get a slave, you get it to work, and off of the profit you make, you pay for it. You damn near make monthly payments, monthly installments. You did that with slaves, just like you're doing it today with your car. Right? So were slaves treated as adopted children? Benjamin Salt claimed slaves were merely servants who made up part of their master's family, although he did not investigate slavery as thoroughly as we did. Salt should have qualified this statement, which nonetheless gives an idea of the character of slavery in New France. By law or through custom, Pani and Amerindians from several other nations were handed over to servitude and presented as adopted children, which is another reason why they're not being in civil registries presented as slaves, because they're being presented as adopted children. You understand? Or as property of such and such. When the Pani Charlotte was buried on April 13th, 1777 in Terrebonne, at the age of 5 years, she belonged by adoption to Hyacinthe Jani. When the fox Michel Louis, aged 6, was baptized on September 29th, 1718, he was recorded as having been adopted by Lanoulier. When the fox Jean-Baptiste was baptized on November 26, 1715, he was adopted by Jacques Hubert Lacroix. The same could be said for the Missouri Joseph Nicholas, aged 9 years, whose July 18, 1731 act of baptism stated that he had been previously adopted by the late Joseph Legris. You understand? Let's skip this. So it says sometimes civil registries simply indicate adopted children, adopted child, Salakia. So these slaves were just registered as adopted or property of such and such. Let's skip down. These Amerindians were sometimes later identified in records as the property of their masters. But the fact that they were characterized as adopted children gives a whole different flavor to slavery in New France as compared to the French West Indies. For those who don't know, the French West Indies they're damn near boasting about slavery, or more than the U.S. I'm gonna tell you right now. But nonetheless, the only difference is that they were not shy to say that there were slaves in Martinique, Haiti, Saint Martin, Saint Bart's, Guadeloupe, French Guiana, or even Saint Lucia or Dominica when they were under the French, as opposed to Canada, who's hiding everything. Say, you know what, we don't like the term slave. Let's say savage belonging to someone, or adopted child belonging to someone, Negro belonging to such and such, you know, what's his name, Francois Legault, or whatever the name is, Justin Trudeau. You understand? Slovakia. Whether the master treated his slaves as an adopted child or not, the slave received special care. For example, a newborn slave was sometimes put out to nurse. Was this an indication of the master's paternal concern, or simply of his desire to maintain the quality of livestock? You're not buying slave for them to die the next day. You need to make sure that they could work. What does that mean? First of all, they were getting slaves from even younger age than 5-year-old. First of all. Second, it's not that they cared about the slave. They need to make sure that baby don't die. How is this newborn slave going to serve me if he dies in 3 days, right? They took care of the slaves, not because they cared for them, but if your worker dies, who's going to do the work? Slovakia. He could have both motivation. When Pierre Rimbaud, unnamed Pani slave, gave birth to a son, Joseph, in 1723, the master put the child out to nurse in the household of the parishioner of Rivière des Prairies. Nicolas Benoit, husband of Catherine Thibault, the child died here, aged 6 weeks, and was buried on June 1st, 1723. Slovakia. When the Fox Marie, belonging to the widow of Georges Renard Duplessis, gave birth in December 1727 to an illegitimate daughter she had with Le Verrier the Younger, the child was sent to the Ancienne Lorette, a place where people in Quebec often put their children out to nurse. The illegitimate infant girl, Marie-Françoise, was buried on January 25th, 1728. Marianne Victoire, a black slave belonging to Governor General Vaudreuil Cavagnal, gave birth to a son in November 1757. Was baptized in Montreal the same day. The governor immediately put the infant out to nurse with widow Jeannot Lachapelle at Pointe-aux-Trembles, although the child was buried there on December 1st at the age of 6 days. Here's what they're going to say. They're going to say the slaves were treated exactly how the master's kids was treated. We dying a few days later. You understand? Clearly, there's someone's lying somewhere. Either they were dropping like flies as we were, or we did not receive the same care at all. You understand? Widow La Pistole of Longueuil, with the child died here in August, Slovakia. There are not many historical records of wet nursing, but it seems that the children of slaves actually received the same care as the owner's own children. Now, what they would need to show to prove that is that that they were dropping like flies like we were. That's what they need to prove. They need to show that their kids were dying like we were dying. You understand? That's what they would need to show. If we were their adopted child, their adopted children, right? And we die and we receive the same treatment, why are we dying after 6 days? Why are we dying after 3 days? Why are we dying 2 months later? Someone needs to answer these questions. Now, let's see how horrible they treated us. Yeah? In August 1759, the Pani Marie tried to kill herself in Trois-Rivières. This suicide attempt was duly noted by judicial authorities because under French rule, a person attempting or completing suicide was liable to be punished. Listen, if you kill yourself, and you manage to actually kill yourself, you're not escaping punishment under the French rule. The body of the self-murdered person was dragged face down through town, hung upside down, exposed for 24 hours, then thrown into the river. That's why these people are going to be exterminated from the face of the earth. Like, even dead, they have to abuse us. You understand? You commit suicide, you're not escaping punishment. Let's read that again. The body of the self-murdered person, and as we read, even if you didn't manage to kill yourself, this is what will happen to you, dead or alive. Whether you fail or you succeed to unalive yourself. The body of the self-murdered person was dragged face down through town, hung upside down, exposed for 24 hours, then thrown into the water. And this is not in Georgia. This is not in Louisiana. This is not in the deep south of the U.S. This is in Canada. You understand? Atrocities, just like being hung, being thrown in a river, also happen in Canada. Atrocities did not only happen in the south of the U.S., Central South America. Good night. They were burying us to the neck in the Caribbean islands and letting the ants and the wasps eat us alive. Atrocities also happened in Canada. You didn't even have to be alive for them to be atrocious with you. That's the crazy part. That's what we say, oh, oppressor is a monster. Like, even dead, you still have to abuse us. And this is the same people that we're told and we're conditioned to love. You're asking me to forgive and forget? When they can't never forget, they have to remind us about the Holocaust every year. They have to remind us about 9/11 every year. When the I.S.U.P.K, we remember our history. And this is part of our history, that even dead, they still have to abuse the bodies of our people in horrific ways. And by the way, that was a law under the French. That was mandatory. If you try to kill yourself, it didn't matter if you succeeded or not. Your body was dragged down through town, face down. You were hung upside down, meaning you were hung by the feet. You understand? You were exposed for 24 hours. They're leaving your body naked for 24 hours outside. You know what happened with a body exposed 24 hours? Good night. We're not even going to talk about winter. Imagine in summer. You understand? That body in the sun in summer. Right? And then you were thrown into the water. You were feeding the fish. Salakia. Emancipation was a rare event under French rule, judging from the registries of notaries. Yet here and there, historical records mention free men or free pani. Some of them may have been verbally freed from bondage before 1763. As we read last class, listen, you say you're free, really you're not, unless you have a written paper presented in front of a royal court. While others may have been formally emancipated in their master's will and testament, since this latter means of emancipation satisfied the ordinance of 1736. Under the British regime, emancipation was common, and it became more and more frequent during the late 18th century. Meaning what? The British freed you more frequently than the French did. The French, they liked to have slaves. Them there fought tooth and nails to make sure they had slaves legally in Canada. They were not just about to let them go just like that in a snap of a finger. You understand? Emancipation could be established by a notarized act as under French rule, or where the master provided written permission for his slaves to marry, or the master could specify in his will that at his death, his slaves would regain their freedom. In his will, Salakia, in his will of 1802, Seigneur, which is another word for Lord, is French word for Lord, Seigneur Antoine Juchereau Duchesne preferred not to free his slave. I specified that my Negro Francois Williams not be sold, But since complete liberty would be more disadvantageous than advantageous given his age, I specify he choose a master among my 5 children. Legatees under this will, and that the master he chooses shall be bound to care for him in sickness and in health. Meaning what? He's basically saying it's better for him to be a slave than to be free. That's literally what he's saying. You understand? He said, but since complete liberty, meaning freedom, would be more disadvantageous than advantageous, listen, I'm giving him, here's the freedom I'm giving him. I'm giving him the freedom of choosing his next master among my 5 children. That's what he's saying. Again, he's a slave master of French descent. He's saying, better choose another master than to be free. Now, what are you going to do be free? You understand? I also grant the same liberty to his wife, Mondina, dit Olivier, of Saint Thomas de Montagny, and to her 2 daughters for the time they are required to serve me or to remain in my possession. Same for his wife and their daughters. When I die, you choose your next master. I'm not setting you free. To what benefit? What are you gaining by gaining freedom? That's what he's saying. Better for you to remain a slave. The slave thus enjoyed security as long as he remained with his master, but lost this security as soon as he was freed. Seigneur Juchereau du Chesnay therefore concluded his black should remain in bondage. It was a wonderful idea to free slaves, but in gaining that liberty, which humans everywhere naturally desire, these slaves should not become a burden for society. The arrival of Native Amerindian women in Quebec society continually raised the delicate question of relations with their masters and compatriots. As we seen earlier last class, right? A lot of these devils, they prefer to get native women. They're just sexual deviants. That's it. Throughout our colonial history, Canadian men who powerfully attracted the savage women. So like we're powerfully attracted to savage women. They were lusted after our sisters. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. While Amerindian men do not seem to have had any particular interest in Canadian women. It's not natural for us to lust after the heathens. Our God brothers were looking at these despicable heathens like Christ was looking at the white woman at the well. She's a whore. They were looking at them like Christ was looking at the what do you call it again? The Syrophoenician woman. Christ called the white woman a bitch. Salakia. Our Gadai brothers did not have interest in these Caucasian dogs at all, as opposed to these Canadian men who came and were lusting after our sisters. The Jesuit Charlevoix praised Amerindian men in this respect. Listen, nations will respect you because you don't break the laws. I'm not saying they had the truth. They did not break any laws. I'm saying, listen, and even then, in that case, it's not about respecting them for not choosing white women. You understand? It's a disgust for them to see their women with us anyways. And we should not even be with their women. Because we should not be with heathens, because God said so. None of them ever took any liberties with French women, even when they had taken the latter prisoner. They were not tempted to do so, and it is hoped that French men develop a similar distaste for Amerindian women. Why? Because, again, it was just lust, but even their lust for them is disgusting to even touch us. That's why he didn't even want the French men to deal with native women. Why? Because they look at us with such disgust, which is crazy that today we don't mind mixing it with other nations when these nations always hated us. They always looked at us with disgust. They did not find these women attractive, like, they're beautiful and they want to build family with them. All these so-called, listen, first of all, they call them savage women. They did not shy of calling them savage women, and they were enslaving them. If they really liked these women, why would they? enslave them. Here's why. Because now that they're slaves, they could do anything they want to them legally. You understand? Canadian men sought the maximum advantage in buying Amerindian women slaves. Their natural attraction for these slave women was greatly stimulated by living with them on a day-to-day basis. Now that they have these women as slaves, you don't have to dream about them. They could do whatever the hell they want, whenever they want to these women. Now we're almost going to be done with this. The anti-slavery campaign. We're going to show you that when they started the anti-slavery campaign, right, not only did they fight hard to make sure they acquired Negro slaves, because it was easy to acquire native slaves, they did not want to relinquish their right to have slaves. No, they said, listen, let's keep it that way. The slave owners were getting anxious about the gains of anti-slavery movement. Evidence of this anxiety is contained in a sales contract from November 1787. Slovakia. Pierre Joinville, a resident of I.S.U.P.K, represented by the merchant Louis Olivier, bought Cinda, a 10-year-old black slave, from John Lagourde from the sum of 750 livres or pound. Joinville added an important clause to the contract. Should any law be adopted by the Legislative Council currently in session or by any other authority emancipating slaves and giving them their freedom, the seller Lagourde would have to take his slave back and reimburse the entire sum he had received from Joinville. Meaning, if slavery is abolished, you can get a refund. So it's bad for the buyer. He's losing money. Like, you know, what am I doing with this slave if I can't sell it? Already by 1787, it was clear owners feared the more or less imminent abolition of slavery. Was the Legislative Council of Quebec serious about abolishing slavery, or was it only rumored to be concerned about the matter? We found no documentary evidence either in or before 1787 that would help answer this question. On one hand, Pierre Joinville did not want to pay a hefty price for a slave he might have to give up soon afterwards, whereas on the other hand, John Lagourde may have agreed to reimburse the entire sale in the event of abolition, because he was not that worried it would happen anytime soon. It was only in July 1790 the newspapers began to publish anything on slavery. Salake. On July 22nd, 1790, the Quebec Herald printed a 48-verse poem, Domestic Slavery or Lines Occasioned by the Efforts to Emancipate the African Negroes. We know that these Negroes were not Africans, it was us. And this is just the narrative they push to associate you with Africans, but we're Israelites who were sold by these Africans. The poem is attributed to one Coilus, and we cannot say whether the author was Canadian or whether the piece had previously appeared in the British or American press. This poem is a rather innocuous satire aimed at zealots clamoring for the emancipation of blacks. The gist of the poem is that thousands of people are pushing for the liberty of blacks, which means everyone is a slave, whether of the countryside, of the court, or of boredom. People should therefore advocate liberty for all humanity. And I'm going to see that a lot of these talks about abolishing slavery, because people will move because of poems. That's it. You know, it was just the time of, you know, reading about literacy and things like that. People like, oh, it's a beautiful poem. It makes sense. Slaves cannot be treated that bad. I feel bad because you read a beautiful story and you're moved by a story or a poem that you read. That's it. Really, they didn't care about the humanity of any slave. They didn't care. They were not even human. But that's the main reason why they started talking about abolishing slavery. This poem was first literary piece in this country on the subject of slavery. The following December, a second piece appeared in the Quebec Gazette, The Negro's Recital, made a plea for blacks and ended with the lines, "For though no Briton, Mungo is a man." In other words, although the slave Mungo was not a Brit, he was nonetheless a human being. The author underscored both Mango and Amen to make his point, following the poem up with a brief article on slavery. The anti-slavery campaign gathered steam during the summer of 1791. In April that year, opponents of slavery engaged in a passionate debate in the British House of Commons, describing scenes of torture and everything they held to be heinous about slavery. But in the end, a majority of MPs voted against abolition. Meaning what? They wanted to keep their slaves. That's what it means. Every week between July 21st and September 8th, the Quebec Gazette gave a full account of the debate. On September 15th, the Gazette published the resolutions of an anti-slavery committee in London, which regretted Parliament's continuing support for the slave trade and hoped that the cause of freedom would ultimately prevail. An anti-slavery bill. The anti-slavery campaign waged by Canadian newspapers was modest, but with England, France, and even some American states seeking to improve the lot of slaves, the legislative assemblies of Upper and Lower Canada or Lower Canada could be expected to address the issue during the 1792 session. Upper Canada is what is modern-day Ontario. Lower Canada is what is Quebec today. The House of Assembly of Upper Canada sat from September 17th to October 15th. During this very short session, no measure relating to slavery was considered. On December 17th, the House of Assembly of Lower Canada began a session which would last 4.5 months. The vote on April 19, 1793, showed that a large majority of members of the House of Assembly favored maintaining slavery. Again, they wanted to keep their slaves. And again, this is not history that you learn in school at all. Of these proponents of slavery, we know that at least 12 were then or were about to become slave owners. Michel Chartier de Lotbinière, William Grant, Pierre-Guillaume Guéroux, Antoine Juchereau Duchesnay, Hippolyte Saint-Georges Lecomte Dupré, John Lees, Robert Lester, David Lynn, James McGill. Y'all remember this name, James McGill, Matthew McNider, Louis Olivier, and John Young. Now, why am I telling you to remember James McGill? You understand? I'm gonna show you right now. Right over here, we have the University of McGill, which is a prestigious, the most prestigious university in Canada. It was founded by James McGill, who was a slave owner. The McGill University is considered the Harvard of Canada, which was founded by a slave owner. Who is that slave owner? James McGill. So yes, there are still remnants of slavery in Canada today, such as the McGill University. 12 of 50 members of the House of Assembly of Lower Canada in 1793 were or would become slave owners, while one member, Louis Dunière, spoke against slavery. The other members appeared to have favored the status quo. What does status quo mean? Status quo is just the current state. That's what it means. Meaning what? Just let's keep things as is. Let's not change anything. Let's not go further. Let's not go backwards. Let's just stay where we are. Where we are is we're slave masters and we're trading both Negro and Amerindian slaves. That's where we are. Let's just keep it as is. That's what a status quo means. Just keep it as is. The fact 12 of the 50 assembly members were slave owners did not necessarily guarantee that slavery would continue. But these slave owners, William Grant, Antoine Juchereau Duchesnay, Hippolyte Saint-Georges Lecomte Dupré, John Lees, and James McGill, the founder of the McGill University, Matthew McNider, and John Young, among them, were influential men. Upper Canada banned the importation of slaves. We're going to see that banning the importation of slaves, it did not stop them from being slave masters. That's just one of their cheat code to keep their slaves. They're just not importing more. Let's keep the slaves that we already got. And we're not bringing more slaves. Let's find a common ground. That's it. The Constitutional Act of 1791 divided Canada into two distinct provinces, Upper and Lower Canada. Upper Canada, which eventually became Ontario, was the first of these provinces to adopt legislation specifically on slavery. The Legislative Assembly of Upper Canada did not address the issue of slavery during its first session, which lasted 1 month, but it raised slavery during its second session, which opened in spring 1793, by adopting a bill to prevent the importation of slaves to the province and to determine the conditions needed to bring an end to slavery. The Act Against Slavery prohibited the future introduction of black slaves or any other person in Upper Canada with a view to subjecting them to slavery. Slaves already present in the province would continue to live in bondage, and any child born of a slave mother would also be a slave, but only until the age of 25. So then again, we only damn near live till 25. And not because you cannot bring in slaves anymore, that means that you cannot have the slave, because slaves are already there. You just can't bring in more. That's the common ground that they thought they could find in order to maintain slavery in Canada. We're not bringing more new slaves, but we're keeping the ones that we already have. And when the mother gives birth, I mean, the kid is a slave. So you don't need to bring in more slaves from outside of Canada. You just need to make your slave breed. That's it. As Assembly member D.W. Smith wrote to the merchant John Askin, "We have made no law to free the slaves. All those who have been brought into the province or purchased under any authority legally exercised are slaves to all intents and purposes, and are secured as property by a certain act of Parliament." The Parliament said, listen, you were a slave already acquired previously from before the prevention of bringing in new slaves, then you will remain a slave. It's that simple. As a major owner of black and Pawnee slave, John Askin needed reassurances about the new legislation, but he had little to worry about since his slaves, even those born just before the act became law, would continue as slaves indefinitely, whereas any infants born to a slave mother would remain in servitude until their 25th birthday, which they might not even reach. The Legislative Assembly of Upper Canada had squared the circle by seizing on a formula that satisfied slave owners, respected their ownership rights, and opened the way to the gradual extinction of slavery. The act had one significant and immediate consequence. Upper Canadians could no longer import slaves. Ontario, Toronto, Mississauga, Brampton cannot have slaves anymore by import. They could just have the slave that they already have over there, black and native. But the act also had the longer-term effect of turning Upper Canada into a land of liberty for runaway slaves. For those who don't know, the province of Ontario, right, was one of the main destination for runaway slaves through the Underground Railroads that led to Canada. Another big spot was Nova Scotia on the east coast of Canada. A lot of the black people over there are Judites. Some of them are Benjamites, but a lot of them are Judites who were acquired through slavery or as runaway slaves. Indeed, the Act of 1793 prohibited that any black or Indian slave entering the province of Upper Canada should be treated as a slave. As a result, any fugitive slaves seeking asylum in the province would be released from bondage. And in fact, slaves from outside Upper Canada took advantage of this opportunity. From Detroit, which Britain handed over to the United States in the late 1796, the slaves crossed the Detroit River, while others were spirited out of New York and Lower Canada from 1792 until the early 1860s by a web of smuggling networks known as the Underground Railway or Underground Railroads. People fled Quebec People were fleeing Quebec. They ran away from Quebec. They ran away from the French to seek refuge in modern-day Ontario. Why? Because they were not be slaves anymore over there. If they remained in what is now the province of Quebec, they were still slaves. These smugglers traveled along secret paths and riversides, wetlands. Fugitives reaching the province saw Upper Canada as an international place of refuge, but slaves already established there before 1793 continued to toil in servitude, not because it was a place where slaves were free if they fled to Upper Canada, which is Ontario. That means that the slaves who were already there were also free. Those who were already there before 1793 remained slaves. You understand? The Chief Justice does not recognize slavery. In Lower Canada, meanwhile, the bill introduced in the House of Assembly in the spring of 1793 was still lying on the table, and the conditions of slavery remained unchanged. Slaves in the province would remain in servitude indefinitely. Fresh slaves could be brought into Lower Canada, and once they got there, they would in principle remain slaves as before. Meaning what? You cannot import slaves in modern day Ontario, but you could still import slaves in modern day Quebec. That's what it means. Civil registries continued identifying blacks and Pani in bondage as slaves, and they had done since around 1700 on paper. From 1793 to 1798, owners were still selling or trying to sell slaves, and among these sellers were even find a Catholic priest, Father Louis Payet, among the very last people trafficking in Negroes. In the last confirmed sale we know of on paper, the former member of the Assembly, Louis Olivier, sold a slave in May 1797 to the sailor Joseph Ghent. This last slave sale was thus made by a French-speaking person in Lower Canada. The last offer of a slave for sale was in January 1798. These incidents marked the end of the slave trade in what is now the province of Quebec. Slave owners addressed the House of Assembly. Still, no law in Lower Canada explicitly prohibited slavery. Existing legislation remained in force. If the Chief Justice persisted in freeing slaves on the grounds that he did not consider them legally to be slaves, then slave owners could no longer rely on the protection of the courts. Accordingly, in 1799, a group of Montrealers had Joseph Papineau, a member of the House of Assembly, present a petition on their behalf in the House. Presented and read to the House on April 19, the petition drew the members' attention to the legal basis of slavery. Intendant Godot's ordinance of 1709, which we seen last week, had established that blacks and Pani belonged to those who had bought them as their own slaves. The King of France had never disapproved of this ordinance, which was still in force in 1763, and consequently had become part of the laws, usages, and customs of Canada in 1774. Meaning what? Slavery was considered lawful in the British colonies. An act of the British Parliament in 1732 for the recovery of debts in the colonies included slaves among real states, which means immovable property, which could be seized in order to satisfy debts by virtue of the Act of the Quebec Act. This 1732 Act was in full force in Lower Canada. The act for encouraging new settlers in His Majesty's colonies and plantations in America, passed in 1790, ensured that subjects of the United States could lawfully bring their slaves and other property with them, and could sell them within 12 months of their arrival. Listen, they're trying to find every loophole to make sure Lower Canada is not abolishing slavery. It was upon the faith of His Majesty's government. The petition stated that the inhabitants of the province in general and of Montreal in particular have purchased for a valuable consideration a considerable number of Pani and Negro slaves. and it was upon the same faith that the diverse person, formerly subjects of the United States, had imported Negro slaves into the province. That these Pani and Negro slaves have always comported themselves in a becoming manner until lately, that they have imbibed a refractory and disobedient spirit under pretext that no slavery exists in the province. They started thinking, yeah, we're gonna be free. It was not the fact as of yet. They were not close to abolishing slavery in modern day Quebec at all. Slave owners did not give up the struggle. They were fighting tooth and nails to keep their slaves. And this is the same people we're told to love and to forgive. Indeed, they once again called on Joseph Papineau to present a petition in the House of Assembly. The petition was brought up and read on April 18, 1800. This petition was somewhat different from the previous one, in that it asked the legislature, Salakia, if I mispronounced it, to vest in a more effectual manner the property in slaves and their masters, and to provide laws for the proper regulation and government of such a class of men as come within the description of slaves. The petition repeated the same arguments used in 1799, but this time, instead of merely referring to legal texts, it took the trouble to quote from them at length. The Rodeau Ordinance in 1709, which was never altered nor repealed, the law of 1790 concerning Americans leaving their country for British colonies in North America. They could have provided an additional argument, namely the example of Upper Canada. In fact, the petitioners were seeking exactly the legislature of Upper Canada had established in 1793, that Parliament formally recognized slavery, ensured that slave owners would have full property rights over their slaves, and introduce restrictive measures, if necessary, on the importation of new slaves. Basically, they were saying, instead of canceling or abolishing slavery in Quebec, let's just do like Ontario did. Let's just restrict the import of new slaves and keep the ones we already have. Why not do that? We do not know why these Montreal petitioners failed to invoke the precedent of Upper Canada. In 1791, what was then known as the province of Quebec had been divided into Upper and Lower Canada, and legislation addressing common problems ought to have been harmonized in these two jurisdictions. It was not until 1803 that slave owners made a new attempt in the House of Assembly. Listen, again, they were fighting until they couldn't fight no more. On March 1st, James Cuthbert presented a bill to remove all doubt about slavery in this province and other effects. The bill went through first reading in the House, while the second reading took place on March 7th. Debate generally began in earnest after the second reading. James Cuthbert and Denis Viget moved that the bill be referred to a committee that would report with all due dispatch. The committee consisted of James Cuthbert, Justice Pierre-Amable de Beaune, Alexis Caron, John Craigie, and John Lees. The committee got to work. On March 13, Cuthbert and Caron proposed the addition of 2 members, and François Huot and Jean-Baptiste Raymond were named. But this proved to be the last time the journals of the House of Assembly ever mentioned a bill on slavery. Indeed, after all these unsuccessful attempts to get the House of Assembly of Lower Canada to enact legislation on slavery, nothing further was done. After 1803, the question of slavery never appeared in the agenda of the House of Assembly. Ultimately, no act specifically addressing the condition of slaves was adopted in Lower Canada. It is hard to say exactly how slavery ended in French Canada. The last sale of slaves took place in 1797. On paper, the word slave appeared for the last time in civil registries in 1798. It was barely there in the first place, as we read last week. The subject of slavery was never again raised in the House of Assembly after 1803. And the last individual slave, a Pani woman, died in 1821. Did the history of slavery in Canada end because of the law enacted in Britain? On August 28, 1833, the British government voted to put an end to slavery throughout the British Empire, which Canada was a part of. The Slavery Abolition Act came into force in 1834 and provided a period of apprenticeship of freedom that was to last until August 1st, 1838 for urban slaves and until August 1st, 1840 for rural slaves. But this learning period was soon shortened by 1838. To all intents and purposes, all slaves had been emancipated on British soil. Were there any remaining slaves in Lower Canada to take advantage of this legal emancipation? Benjamin Salt said he had known several Negroes emancipated by the Act of 1833, but not a single Pawnee. What a pity, he felt, to record their names. Given that the slave market had ceased to exist by the dawn of the 19th century, we are inclined to believe that whatever slaves were emancipated by the Act of 1833 must have been very old blacks or exceptional cases. One thing seems clear: no Indian slaves were left in Lower Canada to enjoy the fruits of emancipation. Suffice it to say that in Quebec, slavery withered away on its own, and no date can be assigned to its final disappearance. And don't think that just because legally it's abolished on a specific year that it did not go on. It was gradual. You understand? How can slavery in Canada have been virtually forgotten? The answer is simple. The white man is the goddamn devil the Bible speaks of. That's a short answer. The long answer is historians are surely to blame, whether because they did not examine slavery or because they failed even to notice it. Despite the fact that the historian François Xavier Garneau was born in 1809, which was before slavery was abolished, when slavery still existed in Lower Canada, he completed misinformed his readers about slavery. Contrary to Garneau's claims, slave ownership was just as prevalent under the French regime as it would later be under the British regime. And while Garneau claimed the clergy had consistently opposed slavery, the Catholic Church of Canada actually never took a position on slavery. In fact, we established that senior ecclesiastics, bishops, priests, religious, and members of religious communities all owned slaves. Finally, Garneau left out all mention of savage slaves, who actually far outnumbered black slaves. Coming from a historian who has such a profound impact, this erroneous description of slavery could only have one result: helping society forget the institution had ever existed here. And this is how we're going to end the class about Canada's forgotten slaves. You understand? So what are for everybody who tuned in, right? Next week, we're going to have the class in French. The moral of the story is what? Natives were slaves just like we were. Matter of fact, 2/3 of slaves in Canada, because yes, there was slavery in Canada, 2/3 of the slaves were so-called Native American Indians. You understand? Unlike what French Canadian historians like to say that, yeah, you know what? When they acknowledge it, they're going to say it was under the British rule. When as a matter of fact, almost 90% of slave owners were so-called French Canadians. You understand? And let's never forget that, as we know, as we have to remind our people, the white man is the goddamn devil the Bible speaks of, and he's going to change like the Muslim coward in the chat. All right. With that said, I'm going to get a security announcements to water for everybody who tuned in. Tune in next Thursday for the Brotherhood class in English, 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And next Sunday, we'll have the history class, but in French. All right. Wada and shalom to all the brothers. To all the sisters. Get a security announcements. We're going to end it. This is I.S.U.P.K security announcements. We are the I.S.U.P.K, started at 1 West 125th Street, Harlem, New York, under Commanding General YAHANNA. Rule for new brother and sister: when a new brother or sister comes into the school, they are off limits for 6 months. They are to be saluted only. Salakia. They are here to shed themselves of the world. If they need transportation, the teacher will arrange it. After 6 months, after 6 months, if your brother or sister has an interest in a particular person, he or she must get permission from the head to speak to her brother or sister. There's another 6 months in which the brother and sister will court each other. After the 6 months period, the brother and sister will get permission from the head to marry. Tithes, which is a commandment. Numbers chapter 18, verse 21, and Malachi chapter 3, verse 8 to 10. Means tenth in the Hebrew, ma'ashra. 10% of every penny of any increase the Lord gives you. Give to the treasury department or teacher. Priest fund, free will offering for priests, which is not mandatory, whatsoever amounts you would like. Upcoming holy convocation, I'm going to give it to y'all right now. Upcoming holy convocation, we have the Feast of Purim, which is the 14th day and the 15th day of the 12th month, which falls on Thursday, the 13th of March, and Friday, the 14th of March, 2025. You can read more about it in the book of Esther, chapter 20, in the book of Esther, chapter 9, verse 20 to 31. Reminded to all Akim and Aquatian to check the bulletin board in the hallway of the school. They have a physical location. And if anyone wants to be a trooper in the school, to start wearing all black, boots, shirts, pants, headband, and scarf. But that's how we'll give a courtesy salute to the brothers and a courtesy salute to the sisters. Minavijal Imajim, which means to stand. We'll give a courtesy salute to the brothers. Minavijal Imajim Shabbat. Imajim Barak. Yahweh Ba'ashem, Yahweh Shai Brakatham. Meaning Yahweh, in the name of Yahweh Shai bless y'all. Yajamata, which means hands down. Sar, which means to turn. So turn and face the sisters if you have any in your presence. We'll give them a courtesy salute as well. Menavijal Amajam Shabbat. Imajam Barak. Yahweh Shemar Alatan Ba'ashem Yahweh Shai. Meaning Yahweh watch over y'all in the name of Yahweh Shai. Yajamata, class dismissed.
Welcome to Atlanta. Crisis Officer 5000, Jeremiah, the camp leader of Atlanta. Passover 2025, starting April the 9th, we got the lamb slaughter. April the 10th, we got General Muhammad's class. April the 11th, we got the black party that's gonna have the Hebrew graduation. April the 12th, in Atlanta, Georgia, the 56th annual Passover, the only Passover under Commander Junior YAHANNA.
Our great and holy King have honored us for turning our lives from the darkness to the light, man. There's no greater gift you can receive than to wake up to the truth and then commit your life to saving your brothers, man. That's right. Looking in their eyes and seeing their faces and seeing what they've suffered and what they've gone through and seeing the end of it, man. It is a guaranteed seat in the kingdom of heaven, man. So in the name of our King Yahweh Shai, do we dedicate us another Passover of brothers and sisters' lives being saved.
April the 13th, we got the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Shalom.
Hey, listen, brothers and sisters, man, if you like what you hear, hit the subscribe button, man. Subscribe to this channel. And also, please, go to isupk.com and pay your tithe. Drop me some cash so we can move around this planet like we need to, man, and do the things we need to do.